peak, turn-based games. One of the oldest forms of video games, dating all the way back from the 80s. While being one of the more controversial genres of modern gaming, turn-based games have always been very prominent in a lot of older video games. There's always new games coming out every year that decide to do turn-based, whether it's for budget limitations or because they believe it's a genuine refresher for the series. But it seems as if developers have strayed farther and farther away from turn-based, as it's become more of a niche genre in the past couple of years. It kind of feels like everyone nowadays wants to play a high-action, adrenaline-based game rather than a traditional strategical turn-based game like before, which is fine. I mean, we aren't being held back by the limitations of technology like before, and games have of course evolved and changed to where shit like this can happen as a regular cutscene. Where franchises like Final Fantasy started and got big off of their intuitive and fun use of turn-based combat, it was definitely more of a limitational choice rather than a creative choice at the time. I mean, Final Fantasy VII, for example, costed literally $45 million to make, with an extremely ambitious plotline, pre-rendered cutscenes, open-world exploration, and some extremely fashionable anime boys. With a budget like that, and given how limited PS1 hardware was, they would of course continue its turn-based gameplay, and the in-game models would look like this. During the PS1 era, genres like horror and action and platforming were starting to grow and gain lots of tractions, with some creative games like Metal Gear Solid breaking away from the modern norm and also advancing in its own department. This would of course be applied to turn-based games as well, with Chrono Cross, Xenogears, The Legend of Dragoon, Final Fantasy VII, and Final Fantasy IX were some of the biggest highlights of that entire generation. And the advancements and improvements of turn-based JRPGs from the PS1 generation compared to the PS2 generation is drastic in terms of its visuals and also its gameplay. And this would continue into the PS3 generation as well. The PS1 generation of JRPGs usually looked a little something like this. Not bad by any means, but very simple in design, with the HUD being at the bottom and simplistic animations for the characters. But for the companies that had a bigger budget, it was probably looking a little something like this. For the games that had the budget for it, there was usually a lot more detail in the battle arena, characters, and animation, with Final Fantasy having some of the coolest and flashiest animation for its era. And then there were some other franchises like Xenogears taking more of a stylistic choice with its visuals and animations, seamlessly fusing 2D sprites in a 3D environment. Going from PS1 to PS2 generation, the change was much more drastic, but I guess you could say that for just about every genre going from PS1 to PS2 honestly. But with the new console and stronger hardware, JRPGs were becoming much more appealing for a modern audience. Now, obviously graphics aren't everything, but for a genre where the large majority of runtime has you staring at this for many hours at a time, having graphics and pretty animations can go a long way in increasing the enjoyment of a game you're spending all this time in. Due to the advancements with the hardware, every game in the PS2 generation were all trying to go for heavy 3D visuals with the environment and characters, and we're all trying to push for much smoother animations and for pre-rendered cutscenes. I personally love the PS2 generation and just how everything looks here, and I also really enjoyed how experimental developers were when making games for the system. A lot of the games that we have today also started around the PS2 era and continue to evolve into what we have now, which is pretty cool. But with all these improvements turn-based games would have over time, they would seemingly be getting pushed more and more out of mainstream popularity, with AAA games moving more into the spotlight. This was around the time where games like Gran Turismo, GTA, God of War, Devil May Cry, and Kingdom Hearts were starting to take off in popularity and growth, so a lot of the media and overall attention was shifting to those kinds of games, aka the action RPG and open world genre. Even fighting games were on the rise, with the PS2 having fully realized 3D environments in a game like Tekken 4, opposed to Tekken 3's pixelated appearance. This was genuinely one of the largest upgrades in graphical fidelity that gaming has ever been through. Graphics after the PS2 generation would only slightly go up in quality, but it wouldn't be anything too noticeable in my opinion. A good example of this would be the Resident Evil series, as Resident Evil 1, 2, and 3 were all classics of the PS1 era, but when Resident Evil 4 came out, it blew everything out of the water. With Resident Evil 4, the setting was no longer a low-poly pre-rendered environment, but now a detailed 3D setting where you can make out all the dirt and grime in the area. I mean, look at Leon's face in Resident Evil 2 compared to his face in Resident Evil 4. We are now able to truly see Leon's face instead of an interpretation of his face, and he is now able to express himself a lot more thoroughly through his facial animations. Resident Evil may not be a turn-based JRPG, but these improvements would apply to every genre that the PS2 had. Look at the Persona series and how Persona 1 and 2 looked compared to Persona 3 and 4. Battle arenas were no longer floating platforms in space, but would now transition into a more detailed view of the dungeon or setting you were in. The backgrounds were no longer flat-looking low-poly settings, but now stylized and detailed environments brimming with personality and life. And that's not even mentioning how almost every game now had really good voice acting. Before this era, JRPGs used FMV and CG cutscenes as a way to bring attention and emotion to very impactful moments or scenes in the game, but now with this new generation of consoles, it was possible to have this just within the in-game animations and characters. Though FMV and CG cutscenes would still be utilized here, and they would look better than they ever have before. I don't mean to say that games looked bad before the PS2 era, or that they were bad in general, it's just that the system really brought something new to video games that was never seen before, and that is detail and life. It was getting to a point where it didn't even matter if games were good before the PS2, it's just with how good graphics we're getting now, and how much more versatile games we're playing, this was capturing everyone's attention, from diehard to casual gamers. With some JRPGs like SMT Nocturne, Digital Devil Saga, Tales of Destiny, Star Ocean, Persona 3 and 4, and Dark Cloud were some of the most criminally underrated games for their era. The only game to break out of this curse and gain lots of attention would be Final Fantasy X, for obvious reasons. Literally everyone knew about Final Fantasy X, as it was not only one of the best PS2 JRPGs, but also because it carried one of the most interesting and impactful stories the system had to offer. Nowadays, it feels like turn-based games are becoming more and more of a stylistic and creative choice, as it's become one of the more obscure genres of the past couple of years. Modern games are moving farther and farther away from turn-based, that some franchises that started with turn-based would evolve into different genres in later games. Final Fantasy, starting with its simplistic gameplay and job system, would eventually move to the creative active time-based gameplay in the PS1 era, to the conditioned time-based system in Final Fantasy X, before completely abandoning turn-based in Final Fantasy XV. Final Fantasy would more so abandon its roots in favor for a more modern style of gameplay, with Final Fantasy XV being the first mainline story-based game to not be in some sort of turn-based style. Then there's the Final Fantasy VII Remake, which also abandoned turn-based in favor for more action-oriented combat, and of course the latest entry being Final Fantasy XVI literally had the gameplay director from Devil May Cry help create the combat of the game. Plus, with the PS3 generation having little to no kinds of relevant JRPGs other than a few, it didn't really help its case. But it does make sense, as this was the generation where multiplayer games were on the rise, and gamers were bonding more than ever.
Oh, Riot Shield! I'm a pussy that use Riot Shield!
Oh, I'm a what do you want me to use?
Faggot.
You tell me what you want to use.
Prestige, you fucking fag.
Tell me what the fuck it is.
Turn-based games were kind of becoming a risk nowadays. It's very far from mainstream, and it's not something that developers want to invest in unless they know they can pull it off. There is of course your Pokemon, Fire Emblem, and random indie JRPG, but a lot of these started from scratch with turn-based and are smaller and more niche indie games that aren't trying to be giant and mainstream. And in a time where every game wanted to be the same, uninspired and repetitive game, there was one game that after many delays blew up into mainstream popularity and would be the first of many to bring back a new wave of turn-based JRPGs.
You never see it coming. You see that my mind is too fast for eyes. You're done, but the time has hit you. You're not surprised.
Persona 5 is a game that I kinda want to focus on right now, as it was an amazing refresher to the genre and was a game brimming with style in terms of its visuals and gameplay. It was creative enough to gain a massive following and bring lots of new people to turn-based combat. I remember when this game released and it felt like such a big deal, as a lot of people were talking about it saying it's the greatest JRPG ever. I mean, I like this game too, but I don't know about all that. With the release of Persona 5 in 2016, it was genuinely one of the first turn-based games in a very long time to captivate so many people, especially in a time where everything was transitioning into heavy action-focused games. And with Persona 5 selling crazy big numbers, there was still a clear focus that people really liked turn-based games, and definitely wanted more of them with this level of polish and attention to detail. Persona 5 wasn't revolutionary by any means, as this was the 5th game in the Persona franchise, but with how interesting of a story this had, combined with the very interesting concepts the game dealt with, it made this game feel like a fresh new experience that a lot of people haven't had in a very long time. And combined with its extremely appealing and artistic art style and its stellar soundtrack, it showed a strong level of passion completely absent of what games were pushing out. Persona 5 is a turn-based JRPG that takes place in modern-day Tokyo, where you play as a protagonist named Ren Amamiya, aka Joker. The game would seamlessly fuse dungeon-crawling RPG stuff with social sim mechanics, allowing you to grind a dungeon in one day and then hang out with your friends and do school events the next day, all while very closely tying those gameplay mechanics to correlate with each other. Hanging out with friends or doing certain events in the real real world would give you perks and other benefits in the dungeons and palaces, and it's really incentivized to efficiently multitask through both aspects of the game. And the game would deal with themes of rebellion, identity, and freedom, with the opening directly speaking about changing the ways of society and to not be a prisoner of fate. Alongside this, Persona 5 would have a very consistent red color scheme to it to represent rage and fire, symbolizing the passion of the main characters to follow through with their mission and change society. This has definitely left a mark on not only JRPGs, but also gaming as a whole, as it's a very consistent and amazing package with a consistent theme, story, soundtrack, and a very beautiful art style. Since then, we've gotten a bit more turn-based games in the media, and a lot more appreciation of turn-based as a whole, as a mass majority of developers were way more interested in the JRPG space. There are games like Octopath Traveler, Dragon Quest XI, and Shin Megami Tensei 5 that has come out and captivated their own fan base and amassed big popularity within their own communities. Yakuza Like a Dragon would be the 7th and latest release of the popular Yakuza series, and with the series being known for its very fun and action-based gameplay, the last thing you would expect would be for Sega to completely change the combat in the final release of the game. But very surprisingly they did, and with Like a Dragon being the 7th mainline entry of the Yakuza series, it would be the only game in the entire franchise to have a turn-based battle system. When the game was first being shown off to fans, everyone had a pretty negative reaction to the change. And understandably, as we went from games where you can beat multiple people at a time with cool and funny heat actions to now going into a slower and more strategical style of gameplay with magic involved. But surprisingly, when the game actually released, it was an instant hit, and it would be one of the most popular entries in the entire series since Yakuza 0. People very quickly fell in love with how they integrated wacky Yakuza fights with turn-based and gave it a little magic flair to make it more stylish and over the top. This ended up being so widely popular that there are a lot of people who got into the Yakuza series because of this game, not knowing that the rest of the entire franchise is not actually turn-based, and it actually created a big divide within the fanbase as the future Yakuza games have set to continue turn-based within the series. And for the continuation of the action-based gameplay, RGG would create a spin-off called Judgment, which is like Yakuza but with a cool detective protagonist doing cool detective things. Other than that, there hasn't really been any other turn-based game to have massive mainstream success. There is the really recent release of Honkai Star Rail, but other than that, not much. But another factor that I think is contributing to the decline of turn-based JRPGs would have to be the length. JRPGs are games that are known for their 50+ hour long adventures and extravagant stories filled to the brim with rich dialogue, side quests, map exploration, and compelling stories. And as amazing as that sounds for some people, a lot of people just simply don't have the time for that. The average person is most likely just spending a couple hours on whatever's trendy before hopping off and doing something else with their limited amount of time. For others, they're probably enjoying something a lot lighter like normal length story games. There is one other genre closely tied with turn-based that has not only amassed greater popularity, but also seems more appealing to a greater audience. And that genre would have to be action JRPGs, or action games in general. Action JRPGs would be like the brother genre to turn-based JRPGs. Slightly similar in terms of the defining features of each genre, but action JRPGs don't have turn-based combat and are usually smaller in length. I'll also be throwing in a bit of character action and action adventure into the mix just because of how similar the genres have been in the past couple years. Just for context, Persona 5 takes about 97 hours to finish the game, and add Royal, which adds more content, and that's about 130 hours to complete. No completionist route or anything. Octopath Traveler is a game that takes about 60 to 100 hours to complete, with most players finishing the main story within 70 hours. Shin Megami Tensei 5 is about 45 hours in length, but will probably take you around 69 hours with side content, and Chained Echoes, an indie JRPG a little bit on the niche side, is about 32 hours in story length. And for reference, the average action game or action RPG is something like this. Some of these do get on the longer side for sure, but the average action RPG are more so smaller games that you can enjoy and finish at a reasonable rate. Again, longer games are not a bad thing. Some people just literally want the ultimate game that sucks you in and never ends.
I've been looking for you. Got something I'm supposed to be looking for.
Most turn-based JRPGs just take hours upon hours fleshing out every little detail imaginable. It's literally unfathomable sometimes, like all the billiards minigames you have in Persona 5, literally every minigame in Like a Dragon, and the fact that you can play old Sega games like Virtua Fighters and Outrun, the minigames in Final Fantasy VII like Fort Condor, which honestly could be its own game with how fun it is, and a lot more. Some of these are still prevalent in a lot of action games as well. But for how long these games can get, combined with all the side content imaginable, not everyone has the time for that. Personally, I really do miss the days where I didn't have anything else to do besides come home from school and hop on whatever game I was playing until it was time to go to sleep again. These 50+ hour long adventures aren't something that I'm really just able to binge all day anymore, and I'm sure it's the same for many people out there that actually do like these longer games. They just don't have the time to really sit there and get immersed like they could before. Though for action RPGs, there is a lot more focus on one aspect when compared to the rest, and would be one of the more defining features in what separates the two genres. The gameplay of action JRPGs, or action games in general, are one of the most important aspects in what makes a good action game. Story and characters may still be a priority, but with how a lot of these are normally fast-paced action-heavy games, the flow of combat and focus of stylish combos are extremely important to a lot of the developers when creating these games. I have realized that in recent years, there has been a noticeable rise in the production of action JRPGs, or action games in general, with the franchises that started off in turn-based moving into more of an action-focused style of gameplay. But a big factor in what makes these action games so appealing is just how often you can replay them and still have them feel fresh. These are games that have infinite depth within the combat and are created with the intent to be replayed over and over and over again. These games will typically have a basic starting point where you only have access to a limited amount of moves or combos, and will have a skill tree or some sort of progression towards stronger and better skill sets, with the progression of the game being tied to the progression of the main character. What separates a good action RPG compared to a great one would be just how well they manage this progression system. Games like Devil May Cry and Bayonetta, for example, will start off by giving you just enough to let you mess around and understand the mechanics while not overwhelming you with everything at the start. These games will have you unlocking some of the coolest moves within maybe the first 4 hours, only for you to realize that that's just the tip of the iceberg. In these games, you end up unlocking so much movesets that you may start to feel overwhelmed by how much options you actually have to your disposal. This is not only what will make you feel like a god, but it will also allow you to fully explore each and every moveset, combo, and transformation to its fullest intent, if you are creative enough. With all the different possibilities these games give you to go about each and every encounter, it's completely up to you on whether you want to deal with enemies in a certain way or fashion. This would leave a lot of room to get into an even more enjoyable New Game Plus run, where you already know everything you need to know and could be flooring enemies from the start. This brings an unending level of replayability and gives you full creative control on how you want to express yourself through the combat. There are a few games in the turn-based space that do have this level of depth within the combat, and one of them would be the SMT series, as they give you full control on how you want your own playstyle to be like. SMT5, for example, would allow you to dump your stats into whatever you want, with the most popular builds being the physical or magic build, with both of these gaining new moves relating to their respective playstyles. Then of course there were the 1% of true gigachads who actually chose the heal build. But one game that I thoroughly enjoyed that does the entire concept of playstyle exceptionally well would be
Devil May Cry.
This is a timeless classic and would be one of the first games in the character action genre to really show potential of what this genre can hold. DMC3 is over 18 years old and is still being introduced to new generations of people, speedran, and enjoyed today, and it started out with a pretty amazing and consistent vision of fast-paced, over-the-top fun, and absolutely crushed it with its gameplay and story. Gameplay-wise, DMC3 would be the first in the series to feature different styles within the gameplay. There are 4 main playstyles, being Trickster, Gunslinger, Swordmaster, and Royal Guard, each with their own different playstyles and advantages. Gunslinger and Swordmaster being more weapon-oriented and good for combos, Trickster would be more movement-based, and Royal Guard would be one of the greatest defensive reversals ever. Alongside this are 5 melee weapons and 5 guns that Dante can swap through seamlessly during combat. While this may not be a big deal in today's standards, this was kind of insane back in the day, and it opened a door of creativity that games had never truly explored until now. The level of variety that players had for gameplay seemed endless, and everyone had a certain playstyle that they were most familiar with. And people would often return to try the game again, but in a different style or loadout. Devil May Cry 5 would be the latest entry in the franchise, and is also an amazing title, but it's where the gameplay gets a bit complicated in terms of the mechanics. Dante is once again a highlight here, as he is easily the most complex character in the entire game. He holds 9 weapons between his melee and guns, and at max level can be an absolute powerhouse if you can use him correctly. He has so many moves up his arsenal that he can easily be intimidating and complex for many people, and in fact a lot of people like myself just kinda got the basics down and made do with the little combo knowledge that we knew, and didn't strive to be the best Dante that we could possibly be. Scarlet Nexus is an amazing hidden gem that a lot of people don't know about, but is one of my favorite games in the action JRPG genre. This game would be a little less expressive in combat compared to the other games I've mentioned, but is still very energetic and visually interesting given its cel-shaded anime visuals. This game's combat would be a little slow compared to the crack fiend from before, but that's because Scarlet Nexus is more so focused on its gameplay around your team. While Yuito or Kasane, the two playable characters, would be a powerhouse in their own right, a big part of the gameplay would revolve around your team's special moves to aid you within battle. While in a combo string, you're actually incentivized to use the abilities your teammates have on the fly to properly maximize the combo. Your buddy's duplicate feature or time slow abilities can intertwine with the combo for maximum efficiency, and would look extremely stylish if executed correctly. When played out correctly, it can come out as genuinely amazing and enjoyable, as it's really unique in its concept, as most games from this genre primarily focus on what you can do as the main character. It also has an amazing adaptive OST that can change from exploration to combat very seamlessly, with my favorite being the Mizuhagawa district. Some areas of this game will have some of the most upbeat music ever, mixing many genres like jazz, J-rock, and some interesting EDM sounds. And somehow they all tie into their respective environments extremely well, really adding to the atmosphere and giving every area a divine feel and ambience. But in every area that you explore, they all have some of the hardest and well done music battle transitions that I've honestly ever heard. You should definitely give this a try if you haven't. It's one of my favorite games from 2021. These are all some action games that you can pick up and play, mess around with the combat and enjoy, and games that don't overstay their welcome, with some exceptions like Final Fantasy VII Remake, as it's a remake of a 37+ hour long video game. As fun as it is to play turn-based games, a lot of them are in my opinion missing something, and I think that it's this level of exhilaration and overall power fantasy that these action games can give you. I mean, Final Fantasy 15 literally has a boss fight where Noctis basically turns into Goku and fights a Leviathan, and it's one of the more extreme power fantasy fights of the game. And once again, the only turn-based franchise that gave me the same level of rush within the combat is the SMT series, and that's because of the brutal difficulty unique to the franchise. You need to completely coordinate every single move that you do, because one missed attack and you just lost the entire fucking battle. But that's because SMT uses difficulty to its advantage, and making you feel like every single encounter is vastly different than the other. Also, the press turn battle system is the best thing ever created. Turn-based games definitely aren't going anywhere and will still thrive within small communities. I just hope that they can become mainstream again. All it could take is one game brimming with passion and style to captivate thousands, if not millions of people, and introduce new people to turn-based once more. And I don't know about you, but 2024 is looking like a damn good year for turn-based games. No, I'm just hoping that Digital Devil Saga can get whatever the hell kind of treatment Persona 3 Reload is getting.
So real, will this step with me again?